I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelist who's going to be talking to us about this issue. I'm going to make sure I read these because I don't want to get anything wrong. First and foremost, we've got Dr. Carrie George. She's with the Clarity Child Guidance Center. She's a psychologist and licensed specialist in school psychology. Dr. Carrie George provides outpatient therapy, psychological evaluations, and early childhood assessments. Her clinical interests include developmental disabilities, anxiety, and mood disorders. Dr. George specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy and family systems therapy. Previously, she directed an on-campus autism clinic at Texas State University. Dr. George is also a member of the National Association of School Psychologists and the American Psychological Association. Welcome, Dr. George. We also have the honor and pleasure of having Dr. James Lukefahr with us. He's with the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. He's a professor of pediatrics, Division of Child Abuse Pediatrics, Medical Director, Center for Miracles. Dr. James Lukefahr joined the UT Health Science Center at San Antonio Child Abuse Division in June 2007. He's the medical director of the Center for Miracles, which is the child abuse medical evaluation facility at the Children's Hospital of San Antonio. In 2010 through 2011, Dr. Lukefahr was president of the Texas Pediatric Society, a member and former committee chair of the American Board of Pediatrics, and was recently appointed to the Committee on Child Abuse and Neglect of the American Academy of Pediatrics. A graduate of the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, Dr. Lukefahr is married to Virginia, an accomplished artist and art teacher. They have 4 adult children. Dr. Lukefahr's interests include diagnosis and treatment of abused and neglected children, advocacy for all Texas children in healthcare, education, and political arenas. And last but not least, we have our very own Bruce Thompson. He works with the Children's Shelter. He's the clinical director at our KCI Residential Treatment Center. Mr. Bruce Thompson was born in Paris, Texas. Graduated with the Master's of Science in Social Work from the University of Texas at Arlington, and over the course of 30 years, Mr. Thompson has been working with children in the foster care system. Mr. Thompson is married with 5 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 on the way. Congratulations, Bruce. And I'd like to introduce our moderator. So Charlotte, again, thank you for moderating this for us. Charlotte Ann Lucas is the founder and managing director of Nowcast SA. Selected to lead Nowcast SA in 2009, Lucas wrote her first news story on a manual typewriter and has taught online journalism, web design, digital storytelling, interviewing, and content management systems at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, St. Mary's University in San Antonio, and Texas A&M University in San Antonio. She worked for newspapers in Philadelphia, Dallas, Phoenix, San Francisco, and San Antonio, and her freelance writing has appeared everywhere from the New York Times to Auckland, New Zealand Herald. Her journalism has earned dozens of awards, including being named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Yep. Lucas was named to the advisory board for the Journalism Studies Department of Texas A&M San Antonio and is a founding member of the local online news publishers association board of directors. So welcome, Charlotte, and thank you. I think the panelists are in very good hands.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Is the audio working? Good. Okay. Thank you very much. As I was telling the panelists earlier, what I bring to this is no expertise, but a lot of curiosity. And I'm very impressed with the expertise that is here in the room with us. Tell me something, and please, whichever of you feels most qualified to answer this. How is post-traumatic stress disorder different in children than it is in adults?
Hi, I'm Dr. George, and I'm a psychologist. And generally, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders to diagnose psychiatric conditions. Post-traumatic stress disorder, there is not actually a child version of that in the diagnostic manual. We tend to rely on adult diagnostic criteria for that, which involves experiencing a real or perceived life-threatening event and then having stressful reactions afterwards. This may manifest in adults. For example, someone who's coming back from a combat situation may have recurrent dreams or stress-related reactions. In children, it's not necessarily the same type of thing. And so we take the adult criteria and we bring it down to a childhood level. Some people are actually promoting that there's a new disorder called a developmental trauma disorder that is impacting young children now, and it would be a better way to identify them. Developmental trauma disorders actually involve children experiencing less than life-threatening incidents, such as maybe being physically abused or neglected over a long extended period of time. And their trauma reactions may be different and manifest differently than adults.
I think a big difference, particularly in young children, is language. Thinking about things is how we process what's happened to us, and if you really don't have language skills, you can't really think about what happened to you in words. And so if you can't think about it in words, you think about it with your gut. So with small children, you tend to see a lot of acting out, temper tantrums, nightmares, throwing things, throwing up, things that really come more from the gut. And that, I think, makes it very difficult for therapy in young children or in speech-delayed children, because they just don't have the ability to put things in words.
There are actually some assessments now that are reflecting for children who have been abused, neglected, such as the TESI-C, which pick up on those kinds of issues. There are multiple traumas that these children experience, and have helped to identify those children who are experiencing that. And those children also who are younger and don't have the developmental level to conceptualize the difference between thoughts, feelings, and actions, it is more difficult to work with them and treat them than persons who have those abilities.
Well, let's step back for a second and look at it from the other end of it. What's the long-term impact of abuse and childhood trauma?
Well, it depends. There's a lot of factors that go into play for long-term effects. Some children have suffered abuse and neglect and are quite resilient. And in fact, with a supportive adult and a lot of therapy and high-quality services, do well as adults. A primary source of the children actually don't do well after abuse and neglect, and they actually may have trouble in school. They may have trouble getting along with their peers. The ones that are in foster care may have to go through several foster care facilities and homes because they have behavioral problems throughout their lives that are related to the trauma. And so it can impact them well into their adulthood and into their adult relationships.
And in addition to that, we're also finding out that children who've experienced a lot of trauma are at much higher risk of developing physical conditions that haunt them throughout adulthood. High blood pressure, obesity, heart disease. Actually, you're at much higher risk of that if you were traumatized as a child and if your trauma was never addressed.
And also the experience that children have of learning difficulties as a result of their trauma is something that carries forward with them into adulthood. Certainly it affects their self-confidence, their ability to obtain employment and maintain employment, and those kinds of issues which affect them as adults.
So left unaddressed, it has a tremendous impact on all of us, right? Absolutely.
I also wanted to add to that, as these children who have been abused go into adulthood and get into adult relationships, they're raising their own children, and they have the impact of what happened to them as a child in their child-rearing practices. So early intervention is key to help them on a better trajectory so that when they're adults and when they have their own children, the abuse does not recur.
Right. So we kind of can interrupt that cycle. Right, absolutely. So what is toxic stress? I'm hearing that term. What is it, and how does it affect children?
Well, toxic stress it refers to the fact that experiencing trauma, such as abuse and neglect, affects so much of the way, as we've been talking about, that we not only deal with others, but even what happens internally with our own bodies. So that, for instance, the effect on the physical well-being of the child, as well as the mental and emotional well-being of the child.
When the body is under stress, we typically go to our typical patterns of behavior, and when those aren't effective, a hormone in our brain called cortisol is generated, and if the body does not respond with an effective solution to the problem that it's faced, the cortisol increases, and as I understand, epinephrine also increases, which can cause learning disabilities, those kinds of issues, so that if a strategy that reduces that is not effective, the individual will not be able to tolerate stress-inducing situations very well.
There's certainly regular amounts of stress that we experience in our daily lives, such as being nervous before an exam or for a first date or something like that, and that's actually healthy stress. And our body learns to cope with this healthy level of stress, and we develop, our cortisol does rise, but we learn how to cope with that arousal level in our body. And there's also more impactful stress, which is experiencing like a death of a loved one or that type of thing, or being in a natural disaster. Our body goes under a heightened amount of stress during those events, but they're short term. And so we do go through a stressful event and our body changes, but it's not long lasting, and we do cope and recover. Toxic stress, which is what we see a lot in abused and neglected children, is long-lasting, intermittent stress. For example, you come home from school and your dad gets mad at you because you didn't bring home your homework, so he beats you. The next day you come home from school and you forgot your homework and dad doesn't beat you. You're constantly on high alert, not knowing when this is going to happen, and you're always stressed out. And it goes on for a long time, and you can't get rid of it. And so the long-term impacts on the brain and your functioning are that you're always on alert and you're always aware that something bad is going to happen and there's no release from it. It's a very different level of stress than we experience with those other types.
That was going to be the next question. What are the long-term effects on a developing brain of a child?
Well, it actually looks as if you experience toxic stress long enough, there are permanent changes in the way your brain is wired, which take years and years and years to overcome or to rewire, if you will. And once those changes are hardwired in your brain, then you react to all kinds of situations in unhealthy ways. When someone's under stress, the reactions to the environment is called fight or flight. The only two things you know how to do is either run away or stand up and start swinging. And if your brain is hardwired that those are your only two responses to difficult situations, then it creates a great deal of difficulty in school, with other people, and into adult life, from what we're now finding out.
As far as early brain development in infancy, children go through this thing called synaptic pruning, where if you don't use the cells and the neurons, they actually die off. And so when they are experiencing trauma, their body is learning to react in a certain way, and the brain is reacting to the environment. It's not getting the nurturance and support that it needs, so certain parts of the brain do die off. And then we also have this reaction that Dr. Lukefahr was referring to, in which our brain is actually functioning at its base level, which is to either run away or fight a situation or sometimes freeze from a situation. This is in the basic centers of our brain, and our brain is always using these basic parts in the middle of our brain. What happens is the outer parts of our brain, which involve higher level reasoning, such as problem-solving abilities, attention, impulse control, which are more in the frontal parts of our brain, don't develop as well, and we have problems with that as they're going into school and into adulthood, because the brain is really functioning on a more base primal level. For example, I had this kid who was afraid of tornadoes because he'd been in a natural disaster. So every time he saw bad weather, like today, it's gray outside, he went to that basic primal mode that I'm going to be experiencing a disaster, I'm under intense stress. Reasoning abilities, which happen in the outer parts of the brain and the front parts of the brain, were gone. I would say to him, you know, actually, it's just cloudy weather. It's a very low risk of having a tornado today, but that's not how his brain was reacting. His brain was going and saying, there's going to be trauma now. I'm going to have a disaster now. I can't reason with you. And that's what happens with kids who've been abused. The abilities to problem solve and reason and pay attention and all of that, it gets lost.
Do you also have some examples of how this has made children, specific children in your practice, respond?
I distinctly remember a child who was only 5 years old, and the way we found out that that child had been chronically abused was that every time the teacher in kindergarten told him to be quiet and get back in his chair, he would just absolutely flip out, and he would literally pick up a desk and throw it through a window. This is a 5-year-old child. In exploring why it was that he reacted to just simply being corrected that way, lo and behold, he'd been severely and repeatedly abused at home for as long as he could remember.
Okay. We have children who experience repeated issues with sleep at night, and that's one of the common characteristics of children who have traumatic stress. And their lack of sleep also contributes to a variety of other mental health issues and to an intolerance for challenging situations in everyday life. And so part of what we try to do is to help these children develop through medical intervention and also through behavioral intervention, develop coping skills that help them sleep better, and just those changes commonly affect their behavior in a very positive way.
That's encouraging. What are some other kinds of interventions?
Can I go back to that last one real quick? In my practice as a psychologist, I run into some of the things that I see as far as examples of what happens to these children are problems with social relationships. And in fact, not being able to establish long-term friendships, getting along with their teacher, getting along with their foster families, and that's a big impact. And in fact, a lot of the kids I get referred for autism evaluations were actually traumatized early on in their lives, and I have to rule that out because these kids will look autistic. They won't want to be around other kids, or they have extreme difficulties relating to their peers. And people don't understand that trauma can make a child actually look like they have autistic symptoms with social interaction. And when I explain that to the families, especially the adoptive families or the foster families, it makes sense to them that this is probably what happened.
So what are effective ways to deal with it? What are some of the effective interventions for children suffering from trauma?
Well, their approach typically is to use environmental changes that help the child have a more predictable environment. Karen Purvis and the group at University of TCU have written a book called The Connected Child that has a number of resources in there that talk about establishing expectations for the child so that their day is very predictable, and throughout the day giving them opportunities to know what's going to happen to them, what options and choices they have, and those kinds of things have been effective in reducing the stress level of children. Also, in a therapeutic intervention through trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, you can begin many times by empowering the child to develop some coping skills, such as relaxation therapy. There's also teaching them to stop thinking about repeating the sort of traumatic memories that they have that often cause them stress in a school situation when they're still, those kinds of things. And then exercise also is a very good thing for the children. It helps their brain develop. It also helps reduce some of their tension and anxiety as well.
I'd like to add that, you know, the first step in improving is identifying and interrupting the cycle of abuse and neglect. And it's really incumbent on all of us. If we suspect that a child is being abused or neglected, we have to report that to the authorities. We can't do anything until we stop the cycle of abuse and neglect.
I'd also like to address some other effective interventions outside of therapy and reporting of abuse, including high-quality early childhood education and long-term supportive care for these children. A lot of these children are in and out of foster care with multiple families, and research has supported that being with an adult in a long-term situation who are consistent and reliable and predictable is better for brain development and better for social development than anything else. Also, placing them in high-quality daycare where the children are getting these skills to develop different parts of their brain and learn how to be involved with positive social interaction is key. I wanted to refer to you to the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. They do a lot of research on this area, and they do a lot of policy work on promoting early childhood education. And I'm talking about high-quality early childhood education in which there's not a lot of turnover in staff, and the staff are sensitive when a child has behavioral outbursts and doesn't get along, that they don't immediately kick them out.
That's the Harvard Center for the Developing Child?
Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University. They do a lot of research on this area.
And that's accessible on the web?
Absolutely.
Okay. So we're talking intervention and identifying that there are issues, and then daycare, therapy, getting children in a healthy situation where other adults are around in a nourishing kind of way. Anything else?
Psychoeducation is something that's very important for many children who have been abused and neglected because, as we know, they often blame themselves for what has happened, or they think that they're the only person that this has happened to. And so one of the things we try to do is to help them understand that the things that they've experienced happen to other children, that they're certainly not their fault, and that they can overcome. And I think giving the child some hope that they can overcome things and normalizing those things as much as possible. When I talk to kids who are experiencing sleep difficulties and the issues that arise from that, I tell them about the Navy SEALs and the sleep deprivation studies that have been done with them that generate, psychotic kind of behaviors from people who haven't had sleep for 7 or 8 days. That helps to sort of normalize for those children what it is that they're experiencing, and it makes it a little easier for them to do their relaxation and focused breathing sort of things in the evening to help them prepare for the nighttime routine and to relax and then have a good night's sleep.
Talk about hope some more, because I think that plays a huge role in all sorts of medical intervention, right?
Yeah, hope is actually one of the key things that's lost in depression. A lot of people who experience depression have a sense of hopelessness about their future and the world and the people around them. So I agree that promoting hope, that life will get better, you will have support from people, will actually help to delay some of the depressive symptoms that happen in children.
How do you instill hope?
Well, a lot of the studies about resilience, why some children are able to overcome abusive and neglectful childhoods, has to do with being around at least one person who is, if you will, normal, who doesn't act the way the abuser does, and that person can be kind of a beacon that lets that child know at some level that there is a different world out there where people aren't always mean to children. And just having a little glimmer like that of hope a lot of times makes the difference between recovery and not being able to recover.
I do the intakes at our treatment center, and with every child who comes in during the interview, I explain to them that children who come to be with us typically get better, that their feelings of hopelessness, that their feelings of anxiety are reduced, that they find opportunities to move into their kinship homes or adoptive homes, or maybe even back with their own families. And then we celebrate each child's graduation from the facility, and that helps to give those kids who are there additional hope that, yes, they did it, I can do it also.
Another thing that's important with alleviating the effects of stress in children is to get them so that they're feeling more competent and successful. And one of the places they can get that from is school or extracurricular activities. If, for example, the kid is very athletically oriented, get them involved in a sport or something where they can experience success and people are praising them and supporting them, and that makes them feel like the world is a better place. School is another place we can't overlook. Academic achievement and doing well in school is also very helpful for promoting hope and happiness. And so we have to look at the quality of education as well in helping the children.
And making sure that they're going to school, that they're not, I mean, I think you, at the Children's Shelter, you spend a lot of effort to make sure that their school is not interrupted, right? So that they have that ability to succeed there, and the athletics as well, exercise as well, I think.
We work directly with the schools that provide special education services to our children and meet with them on a weekly basis to talk about the children, what's going on in the lives of the children, any particular stressors that they're experiencing. If we know about triggers that children have, triggers are things that remind them of their trauma experience. We try to educate them about those things. We also try to educate them about approaches that work with the children in terms of helping them use their coping skills or calming down, or how to structure their classrooms so that they're less stress-inducing for the children. One thing I want to say that I did mention earlier about Dr. Purvis's and Dr. Cross's book, The Connected Child, is there is a chapter in there on nutrition that talks about nutritional approaches to help these children. And they cite a number of research studies that show that even dietary supplements have decreased the need for psychotropic medications and had positive outcomes for the children in managing their anxiety and depression. And so those things are also things that one should consider, and of course trying to stay away from caffeinated drinks and sugar, and try to balance the food issues. Many children who have been abused and neglected have significant food issues that come from, I'm sure, infancy, when their needs were not met on a regular basis. And so they have a lot of fear and anxiety around getting that next meal. And so one of the approaches that's suggested in this book is that you provide children with frequent snacks that are balanced in terms of their proteins and complex carbohydrates, so that the children are not experiencing hunger, and so that their anxiety around food issues is reduced.
And the book is called The Connected Child?
Yes.
Okay. So food supplements and also I suspect things like B vitamins and the things that, I'm sorry, back again.
Omega-3 fatty, I'm not a physician or anything, I can't even begin to relate to that, but certainly those things are recommended, both multivitamins and complex fatty acids.
I'm going to read something from a Time magazine story recently about how child abuse primes the brain for future mental illness. The article says, in the largest study yet to use brain scans to show the effects of child abuse, overall about 25% of the participants had suffered major depression at some point in their lives. 7% had been diagnosed with PTSD. But among the 16% of participants who had suffered 3 or more types of child maltreatment, for example, physical abuse, neglect, verbal abuse, the situation was much worse. Most of them, 53%, had suffered depression and 40% had had full or partial PTSD. Can you elaborate on the correlation between child abuse and neglect and early childhood depression?
When you're a child who has been with adults who have abused you, or caregivers or family members who have abused you, you learn that you can't trust people. And when you learn you can't trust people, then the world becomes a hostile environment. And again, we're talking about hopelessness again. Things aren't going to get better. So depression does occur more often in this population. And they're also at risk for higher suicidal ideation and attempts as well. A lot of the children we see in our facility, which is an inpatient and outpatient psychiatric facility for children, are victims of abuse and neglect, and they are suicidal. So we have to be very concerned about that in this population.
That quote also talks about cumulative trauma, being traumatized over and over and over. And most of us have the resources to deal with single events, like, we're in a car wreck and we have to deal with all that. But just being a child and having to deal with repeated trauma and different types of injuries, neglect and abuse and so on, you can understand how that is just something that children are not meant to deal with, and they just don't handle that very well. And over time, the cumulative trauma really adds up.
One child that I'm working with has recurrent thoughts and nightmares about the domestic abuse that occurred in his home, and he had multiple types of trauma, but what he worries the most about is his mother and her being re-offended against by the perpetrator that was in the home. And that sense of helplessness in that situation causes him to be anxious throughout the day, and as I said, to have sleep disorders as well.
Well then, Bruce, I think you bring up an excellent point, and that is that children don't have to physically experience the trauma themselves. Just being around violence, we're finding out, has hugely negative effects on the developing brain.
And I'd also like to add to what Mr. Thompson said, the theory of learned helplessness, where you learn that you can't fight back, and your brain actually starts to believe that the world is a place that you can't fight, so you become more depressed, and you lose this sense that I can handle things and I can cope with things. And that's a lot where the depression stems from.
So, can I just add one thing? Just getting back to this whole issue of children being caught in the web of domestic violence, the effects of domestic violence are so profound on children that that's actually a reason for intervening in a home situation. And I would just certainly encourage all of us, if we become aware that domestic violence is going on in the home of someone we're dealing with, that also needs to be reported to the authorities, to Child Protective Services in particular.
No, okay. So We've talked about a lot of the ways of addressing it individually and stuff. What about local, state, federal policies that would help support children and their families? And what also may need to be repaired among those policies?
Well, I'll start off, and I think a really key issue is reimbursement for mental health services. And those have been cut and cut and cut repeatedly over the past 10 years, to the point that people who really are experts in the field, like Dr. George and Mr. Thompson here, really can't bring in and recruit the staff that they need to provide those services because the reimbursement is so low. And we really need to convince our lawmakers and decision makers about the really critical nature of the situation.
I know you've probably paid closer attention than most to this, but how would the progress of the Affordable Care Act address that, or not?
Well, it definitely provides more coverage for mental health. And so it would be a significant improvement reimbursement-wise over what we have now.
Okay. What other policies?
Well, I'm not sure about policies, but I believe that all of our major support systems in the community, such as education and public welfare, juvenile services, all of those people need to be well educated about the effect of trauma and effective ways to treat trauma, and to set their systems up to recognize that many of their clients are there because of the trauma that they've experienced. I think our judges need to be well aware of what trauma treatment is and the impact that it has not only on the children that they see in their courts, but also on the parents of those children, many of whom were traumatized as children themselves. And I think they need to encourage providers to provide trauma-informed treatment for those parents as well as the children.
One of the things I wanted to congratulate our current mayor on, Julian Castro, is the fact that he is involved in local politics and he's promoting early childhood education for preschoolers. In fact, he's trying to promote very high quality early childhood education and intervention, so these children get a head start on a good school environment and that sense of competency and success. The place I referred you to earlier at Harvard University is also looking for other national and local policies that involve helping parents when they're in a low-income situation, maybe not have to work that first year of life, so that they can spend the time raising their children in a quality way, and maybe there'd be less abuse and neglect. Also, educating parents on child development and child rearing practices. I worked at Haven for Hope for a while in town, and that's part of their programming there for families, is actually having the parents go to child development classes and parenting classes, so that this cycle of abuse and neglect doesn't repeat itself. So I think that's really important at this city, the state, and the national level.
So expanding parenting classes and parenting education, and which is particularly, I suspect, important in a city where our teen birth rate is so high, and so it's people without a lot of parenting skills. Increasing education, better preschool, education, again, even of judges, education of...
Another thing they were supporting was a very good prenatal care for the mothers who are in low-income situations or high risk. Maybe they're suffering from domestic violence themselves, and that they get high-quality prenatal care.
So that at a local level, how does that happen? You know, what policies need to be expanded at a local level to make sure that there is prenatal care?
Well, that entails making the care affordable and accessible to the people who most need it. And again, part of it comes back to reimbursement. If healthcare providers can't really afford to be in the part of the community where the need is the highest, then they really can't provide the service.
We spent a bit of time last night at UT Health Science Center talking about mending the gaps in healthcare, and those kinds of gaps exist all over where the coverage is simply not available. Right?
Well, there's one other policy issue I think bears some thought, and that is for the families of abused and neglected children, the kinship care providers that receive these children many times from the Department of Family and Protective Services after they are released from treatment. These families really need a lot of education and support when they receive these children, just because the children have been in treatment and their symptoms have been reduced. Without some training and support systems for these kinship families, many of these children will come back into the system because those families are inadequately supported to take care of these children in their own homes.
Can I double back? What is a kinship family? I'm sorry.
A kinship family is an aunt, uncle, grandparent many times, oftentimes even a neighbor who is very close to the family, who knows the children and is willing to take them out of the child welfare system and have them as their own child.
And those folks need tremendous amounts of support as well.
Yes, they do. At the Children's Shelter, we work with children who are transitioning into kinship homes by providing family therapy with the kinship parents and education to them about how to address those things. We even provide opportunities to participate in our crisis intervention training so that they will be as skilled as one of our staff is in supporting these children when they are experiencing the anxiety and distress that results in the behavioral issues.
What else about the social safety net needs to be expanded, needs to be repaired, needs to be changed to help? I mean, it's a broad support here. You're talking about not just support for the children, support for their caregivers, and also education for public policy, for public officials. Where else can you draw to support these kids and their families?
Well, certainly local fundraising efforts for agencies such as the Children's Shelter. We also support and we donate and receive funding from the United Way, so being involved with that agency as well will help provide a broader range of services for the children in this community. No child should be left without care. That it's not their fault that they can't care for themselves or that they're a minor. So all children should be included in medical insurance and supportive health care plans and with agencies that can help them. So I think that whatever we can do to provide funding either through medical insurance or charitable donations to these agencies and these groups is needed.
That turns around to exactly, I mean, we focused on hope for the kids, but also for the people in this room who care very much, and the people who are online watching who care very much. What can San Antonio do? What can people or this community do to help with this problem?
Well, I think education is certainly the key there. I mentioned The Connected Child, which is an excellent book, and it's written at a level that parents and non-professionals can understand. I suggest also for professionals, you might review the Collaborative Treatment of Traumatized Children and Teens by Sachs, Ellis, and Kaplow. You can visit the NCTSN website. That stands for the National Child Trauma Services Network, I think. There's tremendous amount of information for professionals and non-professionals on that network, and also for professionals who want to get some free training on trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. You can visit the website tfcbt.musc.edu and you can receive a certification for 10 hours of online training on trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy.
I'm going to promise you right now that if you go to nowcastsa.com after this, I will make sure that these links are in that story, so you can just go there and get those links from that, okay? And that will require some cooperation on your part before you leave, okay? Go ahead.
I just want to put in a plea for all of us who are child advocates to contact our elected officials and say this is something that our community really has to have, and that is better support for our children starting from before birth.
So you're talking to someone, I mean, the legislative session is going to be getting underway not terribly long from now. What do you say to your lawmaker that they need to address as the session begins?
Well, one approach is to point out that it's one of those situations where if we spend a penny now, we'll save $1 later. If we can cut down on the impact of abuse and neglect on children when they're small, think of the savings in fewer people in jail later, fewer people who need long-term mental health care, fewer people who are experiencing disruptions in their personal lives, and better performance in school, less behavior problems in school. It really is a very wise investment in our future to put a little bit of money towards the cause of our children now.
An ROI question, return on investment?
Absolutely.
And I think that that phrase is more and more associated even with nonprofit work.
I definitely agree with what he has to say. We want to prevent problems before they occur rather than react to them after they're already there. And the best way to do that is to support high quality children's health care.
So how would the legislature deal with that? Would the legislature deal with that with expanding coverage for something? What did you see cut lately that needs to be uncut?
Well, the two things come to mind right away, and that is once again restoring reimbursement for medical services and also mental health services for children. But I would also hasten to add education. The debacle of the last legislative session, the huge cuts in public education have had a whole lot of really negative ramifications for children as well as teachers, and those really need to be repaired. So
it's not even as simple as taking funds toward child abuse prevention. It's making sure that the overall education system is healthier.
Yes, absolutely. You know, there's the safety net really involves not just home but school and all the other areas where children spend their time.
I do want to mention that there's an excellent documentary called Healing Neen. Some of you may have seen it. And it relates the story of a woman who had been in prison multiple times, lived under bridges, drug abuse, lost all of her children. And not until her childhood trauma was treated was she able to overcome the impact of that. And I think when we talk to our legislators, if they could see that, they would understand that effective treatment really can make the difference in changing the lives of people even who are in prison and one thinks that maybe they're lost to society, and make a difference for them and for their children.
I lived in Maryland for a while, and they have a greater tax base, and they actually have state income tax there. What they do with their state income tax, actually, though, is they have really much better daycare systems and things like that, where the daycare teachers actually have to get an associate's level degree at least to work in those facilities, so they retain their staff long term. And so I don't think we should be cutting funding or reducing taxes with regard to children. We need to be keeping that there, like we're hearing here, because we need to prevent these problems in the future. And one of them includes the educational system, and including daycares and training for those staff.
Absolutely. I want want you guys to be thinking about some questions for this panel, because this is designed to be a two-way conversation, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to ask as well. Any more on what San Antonio or what the legislature can do? Okay. Do we have some questions from the audience? Okay, hang in there for just a second.
Yes, my name is Rose Martinez. I'm the founder of Children's Advocacy. I'm in the truancy and juvenile courts, and one of the things that I see a lot of kids is that they've come almost to middle school, high school actually. They've never been ARTed. They've never been assessed to what is going on. These children are missing school. They're bullying. They're just misbehaving. And all they say is, oh, well, kid's just acting up. Nobody is really bothering to pay attention. What is really going on? Is this child being abused? Is this child a victim of domestic violence? What is going on? But nobody seems to care. I mean, I see kids 3 times a week in court, and it's very depressing to see kids hurting. Miss, I can't read. Miss, I don't understand what's going on. You know, Miss, I'm being bullied, or I'm the bully. You know, so there needs to be more, I don't know, some kind of more services as far as these kids being ARTed, because again, it goes on for years. And I can speak personally. I have a daughter that in 2nd grade, I insisted that they check my child. Check my child. She had been abused in a daycare. And it wasn't until high school that they actually offered me services for her. So when you talk about funding and you talk about this thing with the mayor, that is awesome, because when children are that young, somebody needs to stand up and come forward and say, you know what, this child needs to be evaluated, needs to be checked, whatever it takes. Okay, thank you.
Would any of you like to speak to that?
We do provide evaluations all the way down to birth at Clarity Child Guidance Center, and that's one of my specialties there. So if you know of a child who seems to be at risk for some of these types of behaviors, bullying, fighting, dropping out of school, even in the very young ones, we can provide evaluation services for them to kind of determine what's going on. So there are facilities here that can support these kids, and I will go all the way down to birth with these kids. Most of our practitioners work from 3 to 17 at my facility.
My name is James Castro. I'm with St. PJ's Children's Home, and first I'd like to congratulate the Children's Shelter for putting this on. I think this is one of the things that we need to do more often in San Antonio to get the word out and that sort of stuff. But my question goes towards, you know, Annette did mention at the beginning 1,200 children or so come into the foster care system every year. They're removed from their home. At any given time, there's 4,000 children in the foster care setting. We also know, depending upon the data that you look at, that 60% of cases or so, the parents were exposed to child abuse and neglect themselves. So we're not breaking the cycle of abuse. That is not happening. So to put to you, if you had, using one of those therapy terms, a magic wand, what would you do to shake up the system and create urgency that we need to do something different?
Fabulous question. Okay, you got the magic wand.
Wow, the cycle of abuse, that's just, you know, underlies so much of what we deal with, and it entails a really significant community response. Dr. George?
Magic wand to me. Well, of course, with parents, getting them involved in mental health services as well so they can address their trauma-related issues. I don't think that many of these parents want to relive this with their children. In their heart of hearts, they want to raise their child right. So, you know, high-quality, again, therapy for these parents involves psychoeducation, you know, kind of on child development, parenting practices, effective parenting practices, on being consistent, being reliable, having good discipline. And it involves education, and it involves support so that they can, you know, handle their trauma experiences. Because I don't think any of these people want to relive this with their kid.
So the magic wand then is the ability to market something to parents to make them know what's available, or to make them know that, give them some hope?
You know, in our society, it's hard to have a blameless system of care, and when we think about children who are in the system for abuse, it makes all of us sick what happens to them. But as we know, many a times the same things happen to their parents, and we're trying to break that cycle. And I think part of the issue is having a system of care that is as supportive of the parents as it is of the children, and that's hard to do. It's hard to do in our guilt-ridden society. But I think that's really important for treatment. We need to have not only just psychotherapy for those parents who are trying to keep their children, but we need to have wraparound services that are in their homes. We need to have we need to have support services for them to, if they're in a crisis, somebody who can take care of the children for a period of time until they can regain their ability to manage the children. And so I think if we're going to be more effective at breaking the cycle, we really have to put more front-end services, both in preventing child abuse, but also in dealing with the families and trying to keep them intact as much as we can.
You know, I was just trying to think as we were talking, there's still such a stigma, unfortunately, about seeking counseling and therapy. And I was trying to think, well, how could we provide these services to people, but them not realizing that it's therapy? And my mind just kept coming back to education, to preschool education and to grade school education. That's where I guess professionals can really be in contact with children and families on a regular basis, and that's just obviously a real key to having a meaningful response to the issue.
So you're talking about trying to make sure people find no stigma attached to going and getting some help, right? So it looks like something that's a mainstream thing to do, right?
I want to tell a story related to that. I was in Pittsburgh last fall attending a training by Judith Cohen and Anthony Manarino, who wrote Treating Trauma and Traumatic Grief in Children and Adolescents. And there, at the same time in the hotel in Pittsburgh, there was a union, a steelworkers union group that was meeting there. And so I kind of talked to some of those guys while we were there. And so I ended up riding to the airport with these three men. And so they said, well, what are you here for? So I started telling them about childhood trauma, about childhood abuse and the effects of abuse, and about the incidents of men and boys who are traumatized sexually as children. And one of the men in the truck or in the van said, I was sexually abused as a child, and I've not ever told anybody about it. So I think that's just an indication of how critical it is that we educate people about what's going on in those areas and help them to find the resources they need so they don't have to carry those burdens around with them their entire lives.
It's a bit of a magic wand. More? Do you have a follow-up?
Well, it's kind of unfair because I'm in the same business with these folks, so I've got lots of thoughts. But if I could, just a follow-up to that. So the next thing is, what do you think we need to do as a community to elevate the urgency of we need to do something outside the box, do something different to get possibly, again, elected officials, to get corporate leaders, to get faith-based leaders? What is that going to get us over the top to bring the significance? Because, like you were all sharing, this continues to happen. It's going to impact our schools. It's going to impact our hospitals. It's going to impact our jail systems. It's going to impact Haven for Hope. It's going to impact our drug and alcohol treatment centers, and on and on and on. What do we need to do to get to the urgency, or who do we need to get on our side, get on the bandwagon to make this a top priority?
That is a difficult question. I think our mayor is doing a great job right now of promoting these services for children at an early stage. Also getting our media involved, having them go out to shelters and schools and early childhood facilities, having them go and talk to the people who work with juvenile justice, having more media involved with this so they can talk about it on the news and in local programming.
Well, the first word that came to my mind also was the media. And I would just encourage and charge our colleagues in the media to take on this issue and come to the aid of children by sponsoring programs that shed light on these issues.
If I might, on behalf of at least new media, everyone in this room is a publisher now. You're a publisher by virtue of what you can say in your own blog, you're on your Facebook, Twitter stream, on any number of venues. I mean, we are all correspondents these days. So you also all have the capability of publishing your own thoughts about this online and becoming part of at least the new media. So I just want to encourage you to also speak up. More questions? Yes.
Again, just thank you to the Children's Center for providing this great opportunity to discuss this. But I know we talked a lot about increasing the quality of child care providers and the education in our school, and I think one thing that we tend to focus a lot about is on child development and teaching teachers and child caregivers about child development, but we don't really teach them about the social emotional development of children, and knowing how important it is to know about the social emotional development of children, or the lack thereof because of trauma that they have they've received, and how to deal with that, because without having that social emotional knowledge, they're not going to be able to learn their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, if they can't self-regulate and do those kind of things that we want them to do. And just two thoughts about the home visiting programs and expanding on home visiting programs here in San Antonio, because I think we have some in birth to 3, but then we kind of falter off, and then we don't get back involved until the child's in the juvenile system or something like that. So increasing funding for home visiting programs to help with all levels of the child's years and the parenting that goes along with that.
I just wanted to follow up on what James had asked. And I think part of it also goes back to our professional responsibility, that if we're working with children, not only do we have a responsibility to report child abuse if we suspect child abuse, but also to educate the public and the community about the work that we do and the effects that we see on children. And I think there's many organizations, great organizations in town that are working on these things. The Children's Shelter, St. PJ's, Clarity, Center for Miracles. We all have a piece. I think collectively, if we came together, power in numbers, went to our legislator and said, this is what we need to do. We need money for these children. I think they'd start listening, but it's different when one person goes and we represent just our special interest or our individual interest. And I think because children are dependent on this, and so oftentimes they don't have the voice, we have to be that voice, and we need to come together and be that collective voice for them.
Do you want to respond to either of them? No? Okay.
Hi there. I just came, a few days ago, went to the Healthy Futures lunch with the mayor, and they were talking about comprehensive sex education and trying to prevent adolescent pregnancy. And one thing I was thinking about that really correlated with what we're talking about now is allowing parents to prevent pregnancies until they're older and more able to cope with the stress that parenting is. And so I think that maybe increasing access to, contraception. I know they had the drastic cuts to the Women's Health Program, things like this that would really, facilitate families to, plan their pregnancies a little bit better, for themselves.
And in our agency, I work with the Family Service Association with a Methodist Healthcare Ministries project called Early Childhood Wellbeing. And what we're seeing is more and more younger children are being diagnosed and given medications. And oftentimes these are with parents that don't have any regular structure or reliability. And so the ability to give medication the way it's supposed to be dosage and applied doesn't necessarily happen. So could you speak a little bit about that and how we can inform our physicians and educate them about medication to younger children and some of the effects or negative effects that may have on them? And I know we've talked to some physicians and they say, well, I have this mom just coming in saying, if I get called from daycare one more time, I'm going to lose my job. So please help me, help my child. And so we understand the pressure that they're under as well. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I'm going to start off. That's a very important question, and I'm just going to start off by saying that so frequently prescribing medication to a young child is a response to a crisis situation. And it's really kind of second best, to being able to provide a comprehensive set of services to that family and that child. I'm not going to defend it other than just to say that sometimes that's the only option. And these are very powerful medications, and we just all hate to see young children on those kind of medications for very long. I would hope that in the ideal world, a contact like that would also involve referral for more comprehensive therapy for that child and that family.
When I'm providing evaluations on the preschool population, the number one thing I usually recommend is parent behavior management training, parent support classes, along with a referral to a child psychiatrist or a developmental pediatrician who understands the pros and cons of these medications on young children, especially the diagnoses of certain disorders for young children, like bipolar disorder. I hesitate to diagnose things like bipolar disorder in young children, especially when they've had a trauma or abuse history, because they can display many of those symptoms. But the number one things I'll recommend is medical services in addition to therapeutic services and parent supports. As we were talking about earlier, wraparound services, and also getting them involved in more educational opportunities. So it's not one service, it's many services.
Let me follow up quickly. In looking across the country, you've seen many other programs. Are there more comprehensive programs anywhere, or better integrated programs, or better woven into other communities for parenting?
Well, I don't know specifically for parenting, but I know in other states they do have school mental health services where they actually have clinics at the school so the parents can access them. And so if the parent is going to come pick up their child anyway after school, they might have classes for the parents at that time and support avenues for the parents at that time. And they're actually in the public schools. It's part of the school system.
I used to work at MHMRA in Harris County, and I was a rehab clinician caseworker. And I worked in partnership with the psychiatrist, therapist, and basically what we ended up doing, it was a team. We addressed the situation from, skills training to therapy to the psychotropic medication. One of the things that I'm doing here right now, I'm a social work student at Our Lady of the Lake, and I'm actually at Head Start. So I'm going to start social skills groups with the kids and things like that. So it's something that, I haven't really seen in Houston. And so is that followed up in elementary school? Is the funding there to have social workers at the elementary schools, I guess? Because I see it here at preschool, Head Start, but I don't see it elsewhere.
also a school psychologist in the state of Texas, so I've worked in the public schools for many years. I think that those services do drop off. Only in sort of the more high-risk or low-income areas do I see social workers in the public schools. A lot of time these services are being provided by the school counselor or the licensed specialist in school psychology. And when you talk about social skills training, I always recommend social skills training to the kids in the schools, but a lot of times these schools aren't able to do that because of the other things they're doing or having to follow the state curriculum. So I do believe these services drop off, and they're not always conducted by social workers.
In Dr. Purvis's book, The Connected Child, it really encourages parents to do social skills training and values training with children who've been abused, neglected, to help them develop that sort of skills. And we've talked about how many times they have really difficult times developing relationships with other children. That has to do with their learning issues. It also has to do with the role modeling in their homes and the trauma that they experience there. So it should be encouraged for all children who have deficiencies in those areas, but particularly for abused, neglected children.
I saw some other hands back here.
I just had a follow-up question for you, Bruce, on the comment that you made earlier about the van ride to the airport. Being in this industry, when you start talking about the work that we do, people do disclose their deepest, darkest secrets. One of my best friends actually told me that she had been sexually abused by multiple men in her life, some family and some not. And what is the best response to those comments? I mean, you know, one adult to another, this is not something that she's shared with anyone. How do we, I mean, what is the best thing to say, and where are the resources for those adults who need to get the help?
What a great question.
Well, the first thing is you need to make sure she knows that she's not alone. There are many, many other persons who've experienced that out there in the world. As a matter of fact, some studies show it's in excess of 1 in 4 women by the time they're 18 years of age have been sexually abused. And the other part of that is that she needs to know that there are effective strategies to help her overcome the lasting effects of that abuse. One can never forget those terrible things that happened to you. However, with effective treatment, they can become less intrusive in your day-to-day existence and in your relationships with other persons.
So it almost just going back to, you follow up? I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think it's actually kind of manifesting itself in has 2 young daughters now, and so she's like overly worried, and they'll say something, and she thinks that they're being abused in some way, and then she is, you know, and I'm just curious, is that typical that it, you know, she now is having these fearful thoughts about her own children and being exposed to that type of abuse?
Do you want to answer?
Absolutely. That's typical of persons who have had really any kind of trauma. We're talking about the tornado trauma down here a while ago. So if you've experienced a significant trauma, then you have this whole screen that you look through at the rest of the world that affects how you see it. And if you've been traumatized through sexual abuse, you're going to look at it through that screen. Effective psychotherapy can help. Psychoeducation can help. A supportive family can help. And so it's very important that she get treatment to help her, and that will also have an impact on the children.
We at Center for Miracles, we actually see 2 different faces of this. Number one, there's the parent who's overly sensitive and repeatedly seeks examinations and so forth when it's really not indicated. But the opposite is also true, the parents that are in total denial and just cannot bear to think about the possibility that their children are being hurt because they can't think about what happened to them.
So it's going back to that cycle that you were talking about earlier and how to break it, right?
With the family you were mentioning, she has basic trust issues with people at this point, and she's teaching her children not to trust people as well. So I really, as a friend, you don't provide therapy services to your friend, but listening to them and, giving them ideas of where they might get their own help, because now she's developing a sense of a lack of trust in her children, and we have to be concerned about that, because there is healthy trust and there's healthy mistrust, and we have to raise our children in the appropriate way.
Questions? One more, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Hi, I just had a quick question. My name's Ashley. I work a pediatric transplant social worker from Christos Transplant Institute, and I just wanted to know, have you all heard anything about the DSM-5 having criteria for children with PTSD or the developmental trauma that you were also talking about disorder?
Getting into serious technical terms here.
Yes, that's what I was actually, when she asked the first question, how is post-traumatic stress disorder manifested in children? Right now the criteria are for adults, PTSD criteria for adults. There has been a lot of research done in this area where they want to put in the DSM-5 something called a developmental trauma disorder. It is specific to children, and it's specific to the effects that children have. I don't know if it's going to get into the DSM-5. I would love it if it was in there. I've even talked to parents about the fact that this may be what's occurring in their child, is that they've had this trauma, or the foster parents or the adoptive parents, and this is their reaction in childhood. So I hope that it gets into the DSM-5. A lot of disorders are promoted and they try to enter them into that manual, but right now the criteria is PTSD, and it's for adults.
And pull back real quick for those of us lay people in the audience here. The DSM-5, that stands for?
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's in its 4th edition right now. There's about to be a 5th one coming out very soon.
So, and why is that important? If it's in the manual, then that means what?
People are using that to diagnose children and properly treat them.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that pullback. Follow up? One more?
We're talking about a lot of systemic changes here that need to be made. What would it take to get that diagnosis into the DMS-5?
Oops, sorry.
Well, they're working on the revisions, and they're putting that manual together right now, and it's a team of professionals from around the country. And what's happening is the researchers who understand trauma the best are actually kind of lobbying the people who are putting these disorders into this manual, that this is where the research is. The research supports that there is a developmental trauma disorder. Whether or not they accept it from the research teams is, up to the people who put together the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's written by the American Psychiatric Association.
So you're saying the lobbying is underway?
It's going, yeah, it's been going on for a while. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And there was one more follow-up from back here.
Just a follow-up question. If that diagnosis does get in the DMS, would that replace a lot of the bipolar and some of the other diagnoses we're seeing put on these young children as a more appropriate diagnosis?
Well, it's a really important step in making professionals consider the diagnosis of trauma sequelae as opposed to looking at symptoms superficially and saying, oh, well, that looks like bipolar disorder, so I'm going to treat it as bipolar disorder. Hopefully there will be more of an awareness that maybe this is due to trauma, not to this genetic mental illness that really this child may not have.
What he said, huh? Yeah. Okay. Well, we're getting right down to the wire, and I want to ask each of you to give me a conclusion here, and I have to say that I keep focusing on the two words that have come up a lot: trust and hope, and that being kind of at the crux of all of this, who it is we trust and good trust, and also what can give us all hope, and where we go from here. I mean, you've heard some feelings of call to action here. So, who wants to start? Pull it together. Okay.
Well, I've been working with abused and neglected children for over 30 years, and I think for me in the past 5 years or so, there has been an increasing emphasis on evidence-based practice so that we're using the science that we have to improve the treatment of children. And as a therapist, understanding the effects of trauma and understanding the effects of trauma on the brain development, and the ability to modulate one's emotions based on those issues has been an eye-opening experience, and one that has resulted in better treatment for the children that I serve. And so for me, having worked with children for years and years and not understanding all of those dynamics, it is a hopeful thing for me to understand that we are moving forward in our science that's benefiting our children and families. And I'm glad that I've been able to experience that in my career. E.L. Thorndike kind of set the stage for understanding trauma when he traumatized the little child by making loud sounds in relation to a soft furry toy, and created anxiety in a child for no reason. That's kind of a bad example, but the thing is that we learn from that children can be traumatized, and they can associate anxiety with environmental cues that are near them. And so when they experience domestic violence and those kinds of things, we've learned that they can have triggers, and we can help them overcome their sensitivity to those triggers through effective treatment. And so that gives me hope for the future for the children that we serve.
Well, there's a cliche, but cliches are usually true. We've all heard it a million times, and that is, it takes a village to raise a child. And it's really true. Children can't stand up for themselves, so we have to stand up for children and families. And I would also add, we also need to stand up for each other, those of us who are attempting to care for these children and these families that need so much. We really need to be standing up for each other.
To second that, there are a lot of people in this audience and on this panel who provide these services to children. I completely agree with you that we need to get together more, and so that we can have kind of communicate across the agencies so that we all are helping these children to the best abilities possible.
You have on your seats a town hall survey, and what I'd love to hear from you, as I'm hearing people say we need to get together, put it on here and talk about where you want to go with that. And we'll see if we can't do something like this again. One of the fun parts of this is that when Anais and I started talking about this a while ago, and she said, could we? And I said, let's try it. Let's see. Let's see what happens. We can provide the platform. Thank you very much to Methodist Healthcare Ministries for the underwriting that makes this kind of thing possible, and that can make us all be able to get together and have this conversation and to continue this conversation. So I think we can go forward. Thank you. The links will be available. I will make sure that they are in our article at nowcastsa.com. And the article on this is on the homepage right now. We will, within the next couple of hours, update it with all of the links and the mentions, the citations, as long as I can get them from these folks. And if you are unsure about something, you can also send an email to news@nowcastsa.org, and remind me about what I forgot to put in. The village, it works. Okay, thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, you too, James. Good to
off? Yes. Well, maybe. What if I take it off as well? What's so much